Torah discusses this week's parsha. We had mentioned that every community which has 240 people requires a Sanhedrin. A Sanhedrin Ketana, there's a court comprised of 23 judges who are smuchim, who each of them have the ordination of Moshe Rabbeinu, and they're qualified to rule on any application of halacha, whether it's the death penalty, whether it's lashes, whether it's monetary, whether it's penalty. They're qualified to rule on a Torah level. Then you have the Sanhedrin Gedola, you have the High Court, which is comprised of 70 dayanim with a presiding judge, which was 71. They were located in the Lishkas Agozis, in the chamber of cut stone, right alongside the sanctuary, the Azorah. And the Torah discusses Perek Yud Zayin Posuk Ches. Ki poli mimcha dover la mishpot. Bein dom ledom beidin ledin. If there's some issue which is unresolved regarding the laws of the Torah, whether it's dom ledom, meaning a woman when she menstruates, it's very interesting. The Mishnah tells us in Nida that for a woman to be a menstruant, the hue of red of the blood has to be a specific color. And if it's not within the range of 5 colors, although it looks like blood, the woman is not a Nida. She's not a menstruant. However, even time of Reb Lezer Godel, Reb Lezer Honkinis, the expertise to be able to discern between the various hues of blood was forgotten. And therefore, if a woman sees any discharge which looks like blood, we rule that she's a menstruant. Even that's how sensitive and you had to be to discern between the various hues of red. So therefore, halachically speaking, any time you see something which seems to be blood, regardless, the woman is a nida. She's a menstruant. But what about in the time of the Sanhedrin? And there was an argument, what exactly a view of blood is considered tomei, which is contaminated. And the Sanhedrin Ketana, the lower courts, which are very qualified, they have a dispute, and they're not able to resolve that dispute. Or what it would be regarding a monetary law. What is the din? Or nega lenega. What is regarding the laws of leprosy? What is a leprous lesion? What's not a leprous lesion? What is the exact size? And there's a dispute among the lower courts. Divrei rivos, or disputes, monetary disputes among individuals. You will rise and ascend to the location which Hashem has chosen, meaning you go to the Sanhedrin Gedola, they will resolve it. And whatever their verdict is, whatever they say the halacha is, that is the halacha. Come to the Kohen, who are from the Shevet Levi, the judge, who will be in your time, and they will expound, and they will tell you Dvar HaMishpat, the law which is regarding the particular law. And you will do according to what they tell you from that location. Meaning, the Sanhedrin, because they're in that location, and we'll see in a moment what that means, that location is the location of the Shekhinah, the divine presence. You will do whatever they dictate to you, whatever they say, the elucidation, whatever they say the Torah is saying, and you will keep and observe whatever they teach you, they direct you. Based on the Torah which they give you direction, you should not deviate from what they tell you, not to the right or to the left. So we discussed this yesterday, that even if they tell you your right is your left and your left is your right, you must follow what they say. So we explain what that means, that although there are many things we believe to be correct and obvious and simple and literally certain, and all of a sudden they tell you it's not the way you understand it. And all the years that you understand to be that your right is your right, your left is your left, it's not the case. What you believe is permitted is not permitted, and what's forbidden, what's usur, is mutter. But we've always acted this way. We always conduct it. It's irrelevant how you conduct yourself. If they tell you this is the correct way, so even if you believed your right was your right, and they tell you it's your left, it's your left. Left always represents something which is obvious to be right or left, and they tell you, no, what you believe to be obvious and simple and understood, it's not that way. And you must accept their word. Okay? So here there's a Ramban. The Ramban himself writes over here, Ches, Pasuk Ches in the Ramban, very fundamental Ramban. Shu chachmei ha'ir chalukim b'dover zeh metame v'zeh metayer. The Chachomim, mean the Bezdin, they dispute what is Tomei, what some say it's Tomei, some say it's Tor. Zeh mechayv, zeh mezakeh. That's Unclus. Rashi's position is the position of Unclus, and the Ramban says it's not the correct understanding of the pasuk.
Rabbi, can you repeat the pasuk?
Well, the pasuk is pasuk Ches. Ki poli mim chodover. If something has been unclear to you, it's the word dipoli means has been concealed from you, whether it's dom ledom. So he explains the medrash bein dom ledom, bein dam nido ledam yoledes, ledam zover. The Torah tells us that the blood that a normal woman menstruates, when she menstruates, the blood that comes from the uterus causes the woman to be a nida. Yet the Torah tells us that the woman, after she gives birth and she menstruates, if it's a male, from the 8th day onward for 33 days, although she's menstruating and the blood is coming from the uterus, she's not on a Torah level, she's not a nida. She's permitted to husband if she goes to the mikveh. And there's a zova. This is the 11-day period after the 7 days of menstruation end. She has a siding of blood during that time, and that's zova. She has a flow. So we have 3, and each one has its own laws which pertain, although it's the same blood, but yet the difference is it comes from the same source, but yet halachically the differences. Bein din ledin, bein denim momos din nefoshes din makos, bein negla nega, nege odom, nege batim, nege begodim, divrei rivos, hashko sota, arifa segla rufa. Okay, klomar. What does this all mean? It's been concealed. It's uncertain. She poli dover lemishpot bechod mikol tos. V'chotach lono akosub hadin shenishma lebezn agodol homed lefnei Hashem b'mokov sheyivchar b'choma sheyomer lonu b'ferish Torah. We have this question: what exactly is the halacha in all these areas of Torah? And you go to the Bezna Godel, so we have Torah obligation to listen what they dictate and they explain. And they're located L'fnei Hashem b'mokov sheyivchar b'chomashi yom lanu b'fresh Torah. Now this is important. Ben shekiblu perusho eid mi pe'ed mi Moshe pi'agvura. Whether they tell us what the exact transmission from Hashem to Moshe to us, the accurate transmission. Sometimes, as the Gemara tells us, Torah was forgotten. It had to be reestablished. The Gemara tells us in Yevomis that when David HaMelech was chosen to be the king, and Shmuel HaNavi anointed him, David's antagonist, his name was Doeg Adomi, who ultimately, he was the one who actually informed on David that they had harbored him, the Ir Nov HaKohanim, and due to that, the city was destroyed, and he personally killed all the Kohanim because they harbored David, which was considered in Shaul's eyes as an act of rebellion. So he came up with an issue. He was less than 35 years old, but he was called Doeg Adomi. He was called Adomi. He wasn't Edomite because his genius was at a level that he caused the elders of the Sanhedrin to blush. That's what he's called, Doeg Adomi. And he came up with this. He says, David's not qualified to be the king. Why? Because the Torah tells us, Lo Amoni Movi B'Kal Hashem, that if you descend from the Ammonite people or the Moab people, you're considered an illegitimate Jew. And since David comes from Rusa Movio, that's his great-grandmother, he's not qualified to be the king. And it went back and forth, and they tried to respond. They weren't able till finally. The Gemara tells us there was a person that they called him Hayishmaeli because he wore a sword, his saber on his waist like an Arab. And he said, Kach v'kublani bezdino shel Shmuel HaNavi. This is my Mesorah from the Bezdin of Shmuel HaNavi. Shmuel wasn't alive any longer. Shmuel anointed David. When the Torah says, Lo yova Amoni umovi b'Kal Hashem, Amoni v'lo Amonis, Moavi v'lo Moavis. It's only the male line. It's not the female line. Therefore, David is a kosher Jew, and he's qualified to be the king. And he says that if anybody doesn't listen and accept what the Alochim Moshe Sinai is, because Torah says Amoni doesn't differentiate male or female, and Moavi also doesn't make any differentiation. But that is the Alochim Sinai. When the Torah says that, it means only the male line, not the female line. And anybody who rejects this, Yidoke b'cherev, I will pierce him with the sword. Okay? So the Sanhedrin Gedola, sometimes their issues, what exactly is Alochim Sinai? What is it? So the Sanhedrin, they had the accurate Mesorah from Sinai, as he says, from Moshe to us, which was B'Yag Gvura, which the origin was from Hashem, the mouth of Hashem, Kaviyochel. Now this is important. They tell you this is the way, although it's not Alochim Sinai, but there's a question how to interpret the pasuk. How to interpret the pasuk. Now, for instance, you find the Machlokes B'Sham B'Silel, and there's an argument the Yudin will need a Torah and the dresses for him, the 13 methodologies in which we interpret the Torah. And there's a question, sometimes is it, like we find there's Klal Pradu Klal, and there's Ribi Miyat to Ribui. There's a question, what is that particular methodology to come to an understanding of what Torah Sheba'al Peh is? And there's an argument. You go to them, they will tell you how to interpret the pasuk, and they will tell you what its intent was. Now this is it. Ki al das shelehem hu nosein lema Torah. Because when the Torah was given to Klal Yisrael, it was given based on what the Sanhedrin Gadol, what they say. They are the keepers. They are the keepers of the Torah. Therefore, regardless what anybody thinks, agrees, disagrees, it's irrelevant. They are the keepers of the Torah. Although, if you'd say the whole thing doesn't make any sense, it seems they're telling you right is your left and vice versa. But the way you should see it is no. They're telling you your right is your right and you're mistaken. Now, Hashem al Misharse Migdosho. This is the Ramban's words. Because the spirit of Hashem are on the Misharse, the attendants of his Migdosh, Lo Yazov es Chasidov. Quoting the Ramban's words. He will not abandon his Chasidim. You understand? To be qualified to be a member of Sanhedrin, it was just being proficient and having instant recall in all areas of Torah. Hashem will not abandon his Chasidim. We're learning in Misil Shem what Chasidus is. Well, Chasid is beyond being a Noki. We're talking about a person that has no conflicts of interest. That's his dimension of objectivity because of his own dimension of spirituality. La'olam nishru min atos. Hear this? Because Hashem, they're endowed with the Ruach Hashem, and Hashem will not abandon his Hasidim. Therefore, La'olam Nishu Min Atos. Therefore, they merit a Shmira, a Siyata Shmayo, that you will never make a mistake, Umin HaMichshol, or anything which is a stumbling block. Loshen Sifri, Afil Marin Beinecho, Ala Yomit Shu Small Shu Yimin, Shma Lahim. Because who they are, they have the direct connection. Hashem will watch them in Atos. But there's human error. You may be that, but nobody's perfect. In this capacity of communicating the truth of Torah, it's 100%. But there's no such thing. No, regarding them, it is. Why? Because Hashem watches over them, that they should not make a toast. They should not make a mistake. We learned this, I always tell over the story of Moshe Feinstein, that after World War II, there were many couples who were married before the war. And after the war, there was a question whether this spouse survived. So you have a woman, she was married, and now she doesn't know if her husband perished in the Holocaust or not. Is she permitted to remarry? And there were very big issues on this. You had to have very broad shoulders, and you have to be qualified to rule. It's easy to see something's permitted, but you have to be really worthy and qualified to give that kind of ruling. And there was a certain Gadol who was in the DP camps after the war, and he dealt with all these issues. And based on his rulings, there were many marriages that took place, because he ruled that based on the evidence, the husband's no longer alive, and therefore the woman's permitted to remarry. Okay? This woman comes to the United States and she remarries. And all of a sudden, in the 60s, she already had grown children. In the 60s, her husband shows up. He had escaped to Rio de Janeiro, and he came back to the United States. Husband was alive. Here she's married to another man, and she's a married woman. And what are her children? Her children are mamzerim. They're illegitimate. She's a married woman. So they went to Moshe Feinstein to try to work out, to find some kind of heter, or at least it was like so embarrassing. I mean, how does a woman, so they had to understand who originally allowed her to get married. What was the basis for the heter? For a woman who's married, what was the basis for the evidence, or the person who gave the ruling she's permitted to remarry? So she says to Moshe Feinstein, and she quoted a Gadol's name, a certain Gadol who was in the camps. He gave the psak, he gave the heter. Therefore, she's what we call an onus. I mean, she has to divorce the man. Her children are illegitimate, but she's an onus. So Moshe was a very, and everybody knows, reputation. Humble, gentle, not to be described. You have to read the book that Artsco put out on him. And that is literally an infinitesimal part of what he was in terms of his greatness. And Moshe opens, he screams like a lion, and he called her, "You're a liar. That rabbi never gave you a psak, never gave you that ruling to allow you to remarry. It was out of character. People are shocked." And when he said it to her with such directness, she broke down crying, and she admitted she lied. She lied. And the rabbi never, but she knew that rabbi gave these rulings, so she believed the husband was no longer alive, and she knew no rabbi would remarry her. So therefore she felt she'll quote that rabbi, that he gave her the green light to remarry. So they asked Moshe, how did you know? How did you know she lied? He could have said, because understanding, whatever it is, but you say maybe Moshe understood better than the one who gave the ruling. He said, I knew who the person was. He was such a tzaddik. Hashem would never allow such a tragedy to come due to his ruling. That's what he said, Rabbi Feinstein. He will never allow that this tragedy, that a married woman, it should be adultery, and her children should be illegitimate. It is impossible that he gave such a ruling. And this is exactly what Ramban says, that people who are Hasidov, HaKadosh Baruch Hu protects them from making that kind of mistake. You know, Rav Moshe Feinstein, he authored endless responsa. It's called Igros Moshe. Thousands and thousands of responsa. He never, ever retracted from any psak he ever gave. The thousands of rulings he gave, never retracted. And people entered into a fray with him. And he always stood his ground. Chas v'sholom, it had nothing to do with anything. It was all, he was a humble man. It was all based on his greatness. But how are you always right? You know, some people are always right because they believe they're right. But he wasn't right, not because he believed he was right, because he knew he was right, because it was based on his Torah greatness. And it was on his tzidkus. He was devoutly righteous and humble, not to be believed in his time. He could have such a person. So the Ramban says, L'olam nishru minatos. Hashem will protect them from making a mistake. Min amichshol. Impossible. There's a story, the Chazon Ish, who was the leading Torah sage from after the war until he passed away in 1953, who lived not far from Baruch, stone's throw from Baruch, and Bnei Brak, even though Bnei Brak looks a little different than it looked in time of the Chazon Ish. And the Chazon Ish, there was a question of a certain type of small fish. It wasn't sprats. Sprats is a small fish. And Jews used to eat sprats. In the 50s, at every Shalvashurts and Shul on the Lower East Side, I'm sure in other Jewish neighborhoods, you could have been in, Detroit, the old neighborhood, they served tomato herring and sprats, and usually matzah that was stale. That was the Shalvashurts and Shul. And there was a question, something similar to that, whether the fish was kosher. Whether it was kosher, based on the processing, or the species, whatever it was. So somebody says to Chazon Ish that they knew that Rabbi Akiva Eger, who was the greatest Torah sage after the Vilna Gaon, he ate these fish. He ate of this particular species of fish, and therefore they want to bring that as a basis why it's kosher. That's what they said to the Chazon Ish. The Chazon Ish, his position was it was not. And he said, Chas v'sholom, God forbid that he ate that. Why? Because the mouth that gave forth such pure Torah couldn't have given forth that Torah if his mouth was contaminated with that non-kosher species of fish. That was his response. Not only because he knew, but if the source of information, the credibility of what he was saying is not credible, because according to the Chazon Ish's understanding, Rabbi Akiva Eger couldn't have said and come up with such an avalei, which was like almost divinely inspired, unless his mouth was never tainted with eating this kind of fish. It's a whole different understanding. People are so great. It was known to Chassam Sofer himself also was the leading decider in his time. The Chassam Sofer never retracted with tens of thousands of responsa, never ever retracted from responsa. That the Chassam Sofer. Chassam Sofer was the son-in-law of Rabbi Akiva Eger. He was a son-in-law. So why are you bound to the Bezdin? I once had a conversation when I used to spar with this professed atheist, which I'm not going to mention names, and he asked me a question. He says, why is the last word always Rabbi Feinstein? Why is it always Rabbi Feinstein? This person belonged to the Central Synagogue at the time. Why always Rabbi Feinstein? He was bar mitzvah in North Shul, this person. So I said, let me ask you a question. What do you think Judaism is based upon? Is it based upon something that you believe is true? Do you think that's the basis? Because you wake up one morning on the right side of the bed, so then Judaism means this, and if it's the left side, and if you stay up all night and you get intoxicated, then Judaism has a whole different approach. I said, Judaism is based on what we call the Talmud. This is the oral law. I said, how many times do you think Rabbi Feinstein studied and reviewed the oral law, the Talmud? How proficient do you think he is? Do you realize minimally he reviewed the Talmud 400 times? Do you know how much Nabaleh he had written on the Talmud? Do you know how much he's interacted on all the subject matters of the Talmud? And you're asking me, why is Rabbi Feinstein the last word in Judaism? Because he is the expert of experts. And almost nobody's his equivalent. That's why his word is the last word. And the conservative reform rabbi, whatever their understanding of what tradition is, you have to go to Fiddler on the Roof to hear what tradition is. And it has like a musical interplay in background. And then you know what tradition is. And you got to pay for that ticket to get in there. And then you got to fight your way out to get out of the theater after you're there. That's what it's all about. What Torah is what we call what was given at Sinai. That's what Judaism is. Judaism is God's religion. And he says, if you want to know what I said and who I am, you have to follow the Masorah, the tradition, which was given unbroken. And if you have the question, it's only this kind of person who has that dimension of qualification, but it's not enough just knowledge because he's still a human being. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Shomer Chasidov min Atos min HaMichshol. Hashem protects those who devoutly committed to him from mistake and from stumbling blocks, from entrapments. Just to give you a little historical background, after the war, and my only son, Baruch, lives in Israel. He visits America once in a while. They think he's a renegade, but he always goes back. So he's not a renegade. So Rav Herzog, Zechrein V'Rocha, Rav Yitzchak Herzog was the chief rabbi of Israel. And he himself spent 25 years in Ireland. He was the chief rabbi of Ireland. And he had 4 PhDs. One in law, one in literature. He was a genius, but he was a leading Torah sage. And after the war, he had all the refugees coming from the concentration camps that came to Israel. So most of them were very young. They were teenagers, because anybody who was above a certain age could not survive the war. Physically, in terms of the malnutrition and the way they worked him, unless a person was very young, he couldn't survive. So most of the elderly people, maybe per people who were like 30 and above, there were no survivors, most of them. So it was younger, but there were some elderly people, and they had to rule on Aguna. Are these people permitted to remarry? And all these questions were brought to Rav Herzog. And there was a certain kollel in Yerushalayim which had the leading Torah scholars. And very often he would go there to discuss the various sides of the issue and to somehow to have some kind of grasp or better understanding. And then he would give his rulings. Rav Yoshiv, Zecher Tzarech Levrocha, was a young man after the war. And he was the son-in-law of Rabbi Levin. And when he was married originally, he was young, and his father-in-law, being such a tzaddik and holy person, he went to the head of the koll and says, although the people in the koll are in their 50s, 60s, and my son-in-law was just recently married, I'm asking, could he join the group? Rav Elyashiv never learned with Chavrusa. He always learned himself. And he would sit in the corner and study. And they really didn't understand who Rav Elyashiv was, even as a young man. Rav Herzog comes in with all his difficult questions of, could you define some heter to allow this woman to remarry? And he speaks to the elderly people in this group of Torah scholars, people in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and he's just not satisfied. So he figures, go with this young man who he knew was Rabbi Levin's son-in-law. And he begins discussing with him. And all of a sudden he sees what this young man knows, these elderly people don't understand, and he has one of a kind of clarity. In psak halacha, in definitive halacha, in all areas of the Torah, and through the discussion with Rabbi Yoshiv, he permitted many agunos, many women to be able to remarry. And every day he would come to the kollel for an extended period of time. He wouldn't even go over to the others. He would stand with Rabbi Yoshev, that he was old enough to be Rabbi Yoshev's father. And he would discuss this with him, and then he would leave. It was what was not believable. It was unbelievable. After the World Trade Center, there were aguna questions. And Rabbi Yoshev had to rule on many of those questions. What was considered sufficient evidence is DNA. If they have the DNA of the person, is that credible evidence to confirm that that person definitely died? And he's the one who ruled on all this. And based on his definitive ruling, women either did remarry or they weren't able to remarry. But that's what it was. If you saw the way he lived his life, besides everything else, humble, Rebbe Yoshev, unassuming, didn't look for anything. And he studied, maybe he slept just a few hours in a 24-hour period. His schedule didn't waste a moment. I remember I once came to visit him. I was in Eretz Yisrael for Purim. And Purim was a Purim Mishulosh. The 15th came out on Shabbos. So they celebrate Purim on Sunday. Friday, they read the Megillah. So it's really this 16th, they have the Sudans. So I went to visit him early Sunday morning. So it's Purim morning, what was going to Yerushalayim, the festivities, everything else. And his personal secretary, his name was Rabbi Efrati, which I knew very well. And I came to visit Rabbi Yoshev on Purim morning. What do you think Rabbi Yoshev was doing for Purim morning, where all this tumult was going on in the street? I walk into his room, must have been about 10 o'clock in the morning. He had a large Rambam in front of him, and he had his glasses off his face, and his eye was pinned to one of the commentaries where to be able to read the words, you had to have a magnifying glass. And he's fully engrossed. And I'm standing there for about 15 minutes until he realizes that I'm waiting. And he lifts his head and he says, whatever it is, Shalom Aleichem, this and that. It's Purim morning. Didn't waste a minute. And anybody who went to see him, they would speak to him. He'd lift his head, speak to the person. The second he finished the conversation, his head was back in the Gemara or whatever he was studying. That was his level of focus, did not waste a moment. And we told you, Hasidim, you wear a gartel, you buy extra. It has that special certification of kashrus. You have a Mazer, it has that Rizal's commentary on it. So when you pray, the window shape. That's not where Rabbi Yoshev was. That's not the chosid the Torah speaks about, where God protects that person from making a mistake. That's what we're talking about. So the members who were qualified to be the keepers of the Torah of the Sanhedrin, because they were Hasidim, besides, it wasn't enough just to be proficient in all areas of Torah. And nobody was of their caliber. It's because they were Hasidim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu watches the Hasidim min hatos and min hamichshol. That's where it begins, that's where it ends. And that's why they're the final word. The lesser courts, which are not qualified to sit on the high court, therefore their word is the final words. As a result of that, if you have a member of the lower court or the high court who does not accept the definitive ruling of the Sanhedrin Gedolah, he's a Zokin Mamre. He's considered a defiant elder of the court, and he's put to death. Because if they are the ones, it's like you're standing at Sinai, and Korach says to Moshe Rabbeinu, I disagree with you. It's not what you said. It's not what God said. But we're the keepers. Don't you realize you're a usurper? You're undermining the credibility and the validity of the Torah. Torah says if that's the case, a person who deliberately, he will not accept the ruling. That person deserves to be put to death, and you will expunge the evil from your midst. And all the people will, this is public knowledge, why the person is being put to death. And no one will dare cross that line again. It's similar. There's a mitzvah to what? To remember what Hashem had done to Korach. Why? Because if you remember what Hashem did to Korach, the source of machlokas, person enters and causes a dispute, he's a violation of negative commandment. You should not be like Korach and his congregation, his community, where they stood up against Moshe Rabbeinu. So it has to be, without question, factually established. If you understand the liability of going against the Sanhedrin, people are not going to cross that line. But if you don't enforce that, then the question is, who are the keepers of the Torah? Is it McIntyre, or is it Biltmore, or is it Rabbi Feinstein? Who are the keepers? Lahavdil. That's the question. So therefore, it has to be implemented in such a context to understand what it is and what it's not. Okay? The Gemara tells us Shoftim that when the Jews came into Israel, were commanded to fulfill 3 mitzvahs. One mitzvah was to appoint a king. Another mitzvah was Mechias Amalek, to annihilate the Amalekites, because of what they did to us when we left Egypt. They attacked us after Kriyas Yamsuf. And the third mitzvah is Binyan Beis Hamikdash. Kishenichlusu Yisrael la'oretz nitztabu b'shlosha mitzvos, b'shalosh mitzvos, 3 mitzvos we were commanded. Again, establishing a king, destroying Amalek, and building the Beis Hamikdash. Shaul HaMelech, who was from the tribe of Binyamin, he was anointed by Shmuel HaNavi to be the king. Then Shaul was given the order to annihilate Amalek. That's what happened. And what happened? He failed. This is the whole story. They had taken the spoils, the sheep, the herds, and he did not kill the king of Amalek, whose name was Agag. And Shmuel HaNavi killed him. And because he failed, King Saul, Hashem says, I regret that he was put into position as a king, and the king will be taken from him. And David, who's the beginning, he's the founder of the Davidic line, Malchus based David. David was anointed in Shaul's lifetime to be the king. And he was the king. And Shaul soon afterwards was killed in battle with the Pelishtim. And David ultimately wanted to build the Beis Hamikdash, but Hashem said, not you, your son. David conquered Eretz Yisrael. He was the conqueror. But because you are the warrior, it's not for you to build the Beis Hamikdash. It's your son Shlomo. He will build the Beis Hamikdash. And that was the fulfillment, the third part of the responsibility to build the Beis Hamikdash. So it was the king, Amalek, and then the building of Beis Hamikdash. And it's a mitzvah saseh. There's a positive commandment to appoint a king. It's Pasuk Yudalit, Kisavo, Elo Oretz, Asher Hashem Elkech Nosein Loch, V'yirishto, V'yishavta bo. You will conquer it, you will inhabit it, you'll settle in it. V'marto, Osimo Olay Melech. K'chol HaGoyim, Asher Sfivosai. I want to have a king like all the nations which encircle me. Som Tosim Alecha Melech. You should appoint a king which God will choose. It has to be a Jew, not only a Jew, a legitimate Jew. You cannot appoint an alien person who's not your brother, non-Jew, and even a person where he's not fully legitimate. Not person is a convert. He's a Jew, but he's not an original Jew. He's not qualified to be the king. Now, the Torah uses the term Som Tosim Alecha Melech. It should say Tosim Alecha Melech or Sim Alecha Melech. What's the reiteration of Som Tosim? Repeating it. So the Gemara tells us that you can have the greatest Torah sage in the world. And the Torah says there's a Torah obligation to honor him and to revere him. If one does not, it's a Torah violation. What happens if the Torah sage chooses to waive his honor? He waives his honor. So the Gemara tells us, a Torah sage who waives his honor is waived. And the person does not have to give him that level of recognition. What about a person who's a prince of Israel? So the princes, each tribe had a prince. Well, let's say Rabbi Yudah Nossi, he was the prince of Klal Yisrael. If he'd want to waive his honor, Nossi shemochel akvodo kvodo mochel. Hillel Azokim was the Nossi. The story with the people who had the wager, could they get Hillel angry or not? And Hillel, with the greatest level of patience, dealt with it. It was disrespect, wasting Hillel's time with these nonsensical questions. Nossi shemochel kvodo mochel. However, Melech, from this reiteration of the word Som Tosim, Simos Harbe Tosim Alecho. It has to be secure that the king will never, there will never be a question of the level of reverence you have to give a king. And therefore, the king is not permitted to waive his honor. Melech Shemo Kvodo and Kvodo Mochel. And it's derived from these two words because Torah reiterates Som Tosim. So Melech Shemo Kvodo and Kvodo Mochel. So the king tells you something and you defy his order. If he chooses, he could put you to death. And that's to establish him, his dominance and his dominion, that you cannot go against the word of the king. Well, I'll forgive you. It doesn't work that way. Because a king, because the pasuk says, Melech b'mishpat yamed oretz. The king establishes law and order, and everything holds together, society, everything. Only through what? Through the rulership of the king. If the king compromises on his honor, it's just a question of time before people have what to say, and they believe they have a right to say. Within Judaism, the monarchy, if he's a legitimate king, as long as he doesn't go against the Torah, you're bound to his dictate, and he's not permitted to waive his honor. Okay? Now, there's a famous story. There was a king, his name was Yanei HaMelech. This is the time of the Greeks, and he Hellenized, and he was a king. And I mentioned the Gemara in Sanhedrin, the law is, the Torah speaks about if an ox, person has an ox, and the ox gores a Jew and kills the Jew. So the Torah tells us the ox has to be stoned, has to be put to death. When the witnesses come to testify about the ox, and you put the ox to death, you stone the ox, it's called Sharan Nisko, the owner of the ox has to be in court, because the owner is the defendant. He's the defendant. He has to be there. And it's like, really, he's being judged because his asset brought about this tragedy. What happens if a person has an Eved Kanani, a Canaanite slave, and the Canaanite slave commits murder? The Canaanite slave was forewarned. So you bring evidence to the Beis Din, and they testify. In fact, if it's found to be credible that he did, he's put to death. The owner of the slave has to be in court, similar to the Sharan Nisko. So Yanai's slave committed murder, and he was on trial for murder. Yanai had to come to court, and he came to court. But the Torah tells us that a defendant, when he comes to court, he has to stand before the court. It's as I say. It says, Omdu shnei anoshim l'fnei Elokim. The two defendants have to stand before the Beis Din. Yanai, being the pompous, arrogant person that he was, he did not stand. Shimon ben Shetach, who was the brother of Yanai, that a very tenuous, contentious relationship with the two of them. Yanai killed all the Chachamim because they criticized him, and they had rightfully criticized him. Shimon Shethach, being his brother-in-law, the queen sent him into hiding, that her husband couldn't kill him. But this is before this. He was the head of Sanhedrin, and Yanai does not stand up. So Shimon Shethach, who's the Rosh Sanhedrin, says to Yanai, Yanai amod al raglecho. You must stand up. Stand up on your feet, because nobody's exempt from the law. You're the defendant, you must stand. He did not stand. And they cowered before him, all the judges, whatever the story is. So Tosas has a question. The halacha is that a Talmid Chacham who comes before the court, he does not have to stand. Because the mitzvah of, there's a question what the mitzvah is, of Hadarta B'nei Zokein, that you must acknowledge a Torah sage over you, or Es Hashem Elokecha Tiro, the rabbis tell Talmid Chachamim, overrides the mitzvah saseh of standing before the court. And therefore, a Talmid Chacham does not have to stand before the court, although it's a mitzvah saseh, because the mitzvah to revere him and honor him overrides the mitzvah of standing before the court. So Tosas has a question. A Torah sage waives his honor, he has a right to waive his honor. So evidently, the reason why, because the honor of Torah is not as great as the honor of a king. And a king is not permitted to waive his honor. So if that's the case, if the Torah sage does not have to stand before the Bezdin, why does the king have to stand before the Bezdin? That's Tosas' question. Mark, you hear the question? So Tosas answers, Torah is supreme. Honoring a Talmid Chacham is greater than honoring a king. And that's the reason why the mitzvah to honor the Talmid Chacham overrides the mitzvah of standing before the court. However, because as it's based on a pasuk in Tehillim, after you study Torah, it's Torah delay. God says it's your Torah, you have a right to waive it. But the right to waive it is unrelated to its innate value, that there's nothing which is on its equivalent. The king is not permitted to waive his honor because the honor is not his honor. The honor was bestowed upon him because he's the king of the Jewish people. So therefore, it's not his honor to waive. That's the reason why when the Torah says Som Tosem Elechem Melech, and it reiterates this point, it's although you're the king and you dictate, but it's not your honor. Therefore, as a result of that, he has no right to waive his honor, but in terms of it's pitted against the mitzvah of standing before the court, the court is the overriding issue, and therefore, even though you may be the king, you have to stand. Okay, we see the halacha. Any questions on this? Jay?
That was a lot, Rabbi. A lot of, yeah. Maybe we'll think about it. It's a little late, whatever.
Okay.
Go on.
If it's okay, 6:36, we're a little late. It is late, but if so early it's late, then okay. Hope you have enough time. Let's go. Let's see the halacha. We left off on page 235, test. Yesterday we spoke about, Jay had the translation, it was maize, right? Dochen. But we used to call it millet. It resembles grain, one of the 5 grains. If you make bread out of millet, the bracha is what? The pre-bracha is shakol, and the after bracha is buried in foshos. If it's rice, the pre-bracha rice bread is buried in mazonos, and the after bracha is what? Is buried in foshos. If one eats rice bread. So people who have diet issues, and they're not permitted to eat they can't eat wheat bread or grain bread, and they eat rice bread, they're not Yotzei Lechem Mishnah on Shabbos. And they, after the meal, they don't say Birchas Hamazon. The after bracha is burning the foshos. Okay. What happens? Erev, Kemach, Dochin, Ushar Mine, Kitnios. Im Kemach Shal Chamish Zamidim, Bishul B'Gdeira. Very often, you have the question is, what is the primary ingredient? As I always said, whenever you have listed an ingredients, if it says wheat first or oats first, you know that's a primary ingredient. What happens if you have the flour of the 5 grains intermingled with flour of legumes? Like today, you know, they have cauliflower chips, and they have everything under the sun. It's pulverized, and they turn it into what? But part of the ingredient is wheat flour. Ubishlo b'gdeira mevorach burim minim zonos. The bracha is burim minim zonos. Balamichyo. And you say alamichi afterwards. Now, there's a separate question. When it says you said alamichi afterwards, how much wheat flour or the grain was in that cooked item that you ate? Did you eat a kazayas? We said earlier, even if the majority is another ingredient, because grains are primary, they're never seen as secondary, therefore the bracha is burim minim zonos. But the question is now, how much do you have to eat of that cooked item? Do you have to eat a gzayis of grain, which is within that item, although it may be the minority? But the Mechaber says, when you have this intermingling of ingredients, the pre-bracha is burim minim zonos, which is not a problem. But the after bracha is what? Is alamichyo. We'll see. Rather than cooking it, you baked it into bread. Pre-bracha is a motzi. The after bracha is birchas hamazon. Now, v'davke sheish also kemach mechamesh saminim k'dei sheyochel menu kezayis dogon b'chdei achidus pras. That's only if the ratio of ingredients versus the others, that if you would eat a kezayis, if you would eat this particular mixture within achilles pras, which we discussed many times, is it 3 minutes, is it 9 minutes? You would eat a kazayas of grain, meaning if you eat a kazayas in a minute, within that kazayas, you're not going to have a kazayas of grain. But if within 3 minutes, if you eat of this mixture, there's enough of a concentration of grain, you will have a kazayas of grain, although you'll be eating other ingredients with it. Then you say the pre-bracha is mazonos, and the after bracha is alamichyo, a pre is motzi, and the after bracha is going to be birchas hamazon. Avalim ebo ze ashir mechamesh saminim, but if the ratio is not such, ein uvarach libso birchas hamazon, the pre-bracha will be hamotzi, or the pre-bracha will be zonos, but the after bracha will not bench, because it's understood. If you eat less than a kazayis of bread, one doesn't bench, but yet you have to wash, and you have to say hamotzi, because that's based upon the Gemara in Brachos. Also, lehonas mobam bracha. You're not permitted to eat or drink without first saying a bracha. El betchil borach hamotzi, kev sheish bo tam dogon. Again, this is also an important point, very important point here, because it has tam dogon. What about it? It does not tam dogon. When you eat a knedel, let's say within that matzah bowl, you have other ingredients. You have matzah meal, and you have other ingredients, potato starch. When you eat that, you have to taste tam dogon. That tastes like wheat grain. Well, today many things with seasoning mimic everything else. Right? You eat this bouillon, you have these little cubes, you put it in, it's all imitation. What does it mean? It has tam dogon. Aval pi she'ebo k'zayis le'achilus pras, ul'v'sof alamichyo. Let's stop right here. We have seen Mishabura. Because it gets a little complicated. Let's see. It's 236 on the very top. Canal days, because anything of the Chamish Tzaminim, the 5 grains are never considered secondary. The Paschamaru, Kdechilis Pras. Now he says, what's Kdechilis Pras? Pras hu chatzi kiko shel eruv. The verse makes an eruv. It's a half of loaf which you use for an eruv. Eshom shlosha beitzim. Eshom arba. It's a question. Is it 3 eggs, which are 6 kzesim? An egg is 2 kzesim, or is it 4 beitzim, which are 8? Chazaisu chatzi beyo. Says a kzais is a half an egg. Umisharim bo kol isurim. And regarding the laws of one is liable for eating non-kosher, we have a liability. Shem ochel kzais isud v'shol kedech b'achiloso yosem l'chilas shir achilas pras enam mitzaref l'malkus l'chil chatos. What's the halacha? A person over a 15-minute period, he eats a piece of non-kosher meat, one strand after another. But after 15 minutes, you consume the kazayas of non-kosher meat. Does one have the liability of eating non-kosher if he was forewarned, he's subject to malchus? The answer is not. Eating normally means eating, chewing and swallowing at one moment, one swallow. The Torah's Machadesh tells us no, that if it's the achilas pras, if it's within a certain time frame, it's the equivalent to eating it at one time. But if it goes beyond that time frame, although volume-wise you did consume the kzais even more than that, there's no liability of malchus or chatos on Shabbos, not Shabbos. Piet chelev, which carries the liability of a chatos. Or you eat on Yom Kippur, which you have chatos inadvertently. And it's started for shir kzai shelo elak de shucha lochlo b'toch shir achilas pras. V'imkein ein vorach b'chsamozen elam kein hoyimura v'okemach dogan echod nishminis al koponim. Has to be 1/8 because we're saying there's one opinion. It's daled beim. Daled beim is what? 4 eggs. 4 eggs are 8 kazesim. Okay. The ozim yochel mepas arbo beitzim. If you eat of this particular food 4 beitzim, which are 8 kazesim, you're assured within the ingredients of those 4 beitzim, you can have a kazais of grain. It's an interesting concept. Torah says, now when it says you eat means you have to eat one of the 5 grains. So we're saying he only ate a kazayas of this mixture. Only because he did not, but if he would eat 4 beitzim of this mixture, it's a short, you guaranteed within that time frame he will eat exayis. But how much did he eat? When he ate 1/8 of that, he didn't eat exayis of grain, because the exayis of grain is intermingled with all this other ingredients. But yet, nevertheless, he has to say motzi. We understand why he has to say motzi, but he says you have to. One's required to say berachas hamazon.